a small, open boat just fading into a blinding white horizon. It's June 23rd, 1611, in the frozen wastes of James Bay, North America. Inside that boat, Captain Henry Hudson isn't alone. He's with his son, John Hudson, and 6 other men. And they're being pushed away from their ship, the Discovery, by men who have decided that their captain is no longer necessary. Henry Hudson was never seen again. He just vanished into the Arctic silence. He left behind a name that would eventually be etched into maps across the entire globe, but he left no grave to mark his spot. Historian Peter Mancall suggests that Hudson and his men likely succumbed to disease or just froze to death, eventually becoming food for scavenging animals. The map shows the bay, but the cold shows the truth. Subscribe to join us as we uncover more stories of history's greatest mysteries. London was the starting point for a man who would become one of the most relentless English explorers. Henry Hudson, a seasoned sea captain, probably born in that city, was a navigator who lived through the early 1600s. Now, at that time, English traders were desperate for a northwest passage, a shortcut to the Spice Islands in the western Pacific. The goal was a logistical gamble. They wanted to bypass the Spanish and Portuguese-controlled southern waters to link Europe and South Asia. In 1609, Hudson navigated the coast of North America, tracing a line from Newfoundland to Cape Cod, down to Virginia, and then back up to New York. He sailed deep into the river that would later be named the Hudson River, traveling 240 kilometers, roughly the distance from London to the coast of France, into what the Mohicantuck called their land, reaching as far as Albany. He was the first European to penetrate this far into the interior, though the voyage was marked by blood. On October 2, 1609, Hudson's crew killed roughly a dozen Native Americans after being shot at by 2 canoes full of men. By the 1610-1611 expedition, Hudson's focus shifted north. He became the captain of the 70-ton ship Discovery, owned by George Weymouth, and pushed into the Canadian Arctic. He wasn't looking for a map. He was looking for a gateway to Asia. April 17, 1610. The Discovery left London with Henry Hudson and a crew of 23 men. This was his 4th attempt. The water was cold, but the goal was clear. 10 weeks into the journey, the Discovery reached the Labrador Sea in northern Canada at the mouth of the Hudson Strait. The wind was a wall. Unexpectedly violent conditions initially hampered the voyage, slowing their progress into the unknown. By July, the crew encountered ice. Now, for any seasoned mariner, this was a signal of miscalculation. The air grew thinner. The cold began to bite. But Hudson did not turn back. He decided to continue the quest for the Northwest Passage despite a crew that was becoming violently divided. Some of the experienced mariners were unconvinced, but their captain's will was absolute. Then Hudson made a choice. He sailed south. This decision led the crew into Hudson Bay, trapping them as they sailed further from open waters. It was a detour into a dead end, and it was here that the seeds of mutiny were sown. By late October, the Discovery was trapped in James Bay, a smaller basin at the bottom of the larger bay. The water had turned to iron. To prevent the ship from being crushed by the shifting ice, the crew took a desperate measure. They began punching holes in the hull to equalize pressure. It was a brutal calculated sacrifice of the vessel's integrity just to save the men. In November, they grounded the ship and hauled it ashore, abandoning the Discovery to the ice. They shifted their focus westward, establishing a winter camp on the eastern coast. At the mouth of the Nottoway River, they built crude wooden shacks. These fragile structures were all that stood between the crew and the killing cold of the Arctic winter. Robert Jewett, the first mate on the 1609 expedition, had been Hudson's right hand, but the hierarchy was crumbling. For reasons that remain obscured by time, Hudson demoted Jewett. It was a betrayal of rank and status. Jewett, like Hudson and Henry Green, could read and write, a literacy that separated them from the starving men they led. By November, the tension shifted from rank to survival. The ship's gunner died, leaving behind a warm winter coat. Hudson gave the coat to his friend, Henry Green, a small mercy in the Arctic cold. But then, and this is where it gets messy, a dispute over the shacks occurred. Hudson took the coat back. In that frozen wasteland, a piece of clothing was not just fabric, it was a lifeline. Green never forgave him. 1,200 partridges. That is the number Abacook Prickett estimates the crew ate that winter. It was a feast of small birds, providing roughly half a bird per man per day. But the birds flew away. Then the hunger became a physical weight. The men began eating moss and frogs. To survive, they brewed a tea made with turpentine. Hudson tried to find a way out. He approached a man from the Cree tribe, offering a mirror, buttons, a hatchet, and a knife in exchange for deer and beaver skins. He waited. The man never returned. The ice remained, and the hunger stayed. Henry Green and others begun to whisper in the shadows. While the crew were out on fishing expeditions on the Shallop, the ship's smaller boat, they hatched a mutiny plot. The plan was cold and precise. They would put the master, Henry Hudson, and the sick men into the Shallop with only a 14-day supply of food. They would leave them to the ice. Henry Green didn't just lead the others. He hunted for recruits. He approached Abacook Prickett in his cabin, his voice low and desperate. Green told Prickett they were going to mutiny because he would rather be hanged at home than starve abroad. For Green, the risk of a gallows execution in England was a better bet than the slow, agonizing death of a frozen wilderness. June 17th, 1611. The Discovery was finally freed from the ice. The ship was moving, but the air was still cold, and the resentment that had been frozen in the men's minds had thawed. On the morning of June 22nd, 1611, the mutiny began. There was no longer anyone who could stop them. Hudson, his son John, and 7 other men were forced at gunpoint onto the Shallop. 9 men in total, carved out of the crew, cast adrift. Once the Discovery sailed away, the mutineers ransacked Hudson's quarters. They didn't find a journal or a map. They found something more concrete. They confirmed that he had been hiding food for himself and his favorites. The betrayal was, in their eyes, a justification for their crime. Blood still stained the deck of the Discovery as it turned its prow toward England. The voyage home was not a peaceful retreat. While sailing, the crew encountered Inuit locals, and in a sudden, violent clash, one of the Inuit men stabbed Abakuk Prickett in the chest. It was as if the ice had claimed a more immediate price. The masterminds of the rebellion, Henry Green and Robert Jewett, both died before the ship returned to London. They had argued that fewer mouths to feed would increase the chances of returning home. Now they were gone. When the Discovery finally docked in London about 17 months after departing, the cost of the ambition was laid bare. Only 8 of the original 23 crew members survived. 8 men. The silence of the Discovery was heavier than the ice. Stakes driven into the frozen ground. That is where the search for Hudson's fate began to surface. In 1631, Captain Thomas James found stakes on Danby Island that he believed were the markers of where Hudson's party had tied up. It was a grim realization. The ship's carpenter was among the abandoned men, meaning they had the tools to survive. Yet they had vanished. Decades later, around 1670, Captain Zachariah Gillam discovered the remains of a non-native house. It suggested that Hudson and his men may have built something there, but the evidence remains inconclusive. No one knows the final words spoken between a father and a son as their boat drifted further into the white. No one knows if they fought the cold for days or weeks. The ice, it does not give up its secrets easily. If you enjoyed this journey into the Arctic silence, please follow for more.